Everything I wrote about invisible worlds was burned. Why? Have you ever felt there's something beyond what your eyes can see? Some force, a whisper, a silent presence in the cracks of everyday life? Imagine dedicating your life to science, collecting degrees, commanding labs with authority, only to watch years of research turn to ashes before your eyes, and nobody dares to explain why. But behind those ashes, there are unanswered questions. Behind the silence, there are voices. Between what's forbidden and what's possible lies the mystery. Today I'm going to guide you through the journey of Viktor Veynik, a man who believed everything that existed could be measured, weighed, proven, until the day the impossible visited his lab and never left. Hold on tight. Get ready to question everything you know about reality, because what you're about to hear might transform your view of the universe and yourself. Before we dive into this labyrinth of secrets, like and subscribe right now. Only the most curious dare to face the unknown to the very end. And leave a comment. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable? I want to hear your story. Stay with me. The answer to humanity's greatest mystery might be closer than you think. Viktor Veynik was born in Moscow, in a harsh winter, the kind of cold that silences even the deepest doubts. From a young age he felt out of place, as if his mind saw beyond the icy surface of the people around him. He was a frail boy, with attentive eyes, always lost among books and formulas, while other boys played skiing. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union cultivated geniuses like soldiers. Viktor was identified early as a prodigy, led through the concrete corridors of scientific academies. At 16, he was already solving calculations reserved for great physicists. His life was lab, sweat, and paper. The world for Viktor was made of molecules, numbers, equations, and nothing more. He firmly believed that where there was faith, there was a lack of reason. He would smirk seeing discussions about soul, spirit, God. Nonsense. A creation of the human mind in the face of the fear of the unknown, he wrote in his notebooks. But behind this rigidity lived an inexplicable emptiness. Despite his achievements, Viktor felt isolated, as if he was part of an experiment whose ultimate goal he didn't know. His colleagues respected him, but avoided his sharp questions about the meaning of existence. For him, only what could be proven should be considered real. It was in this gray scenario, surrounded by mathematical rigor and state control, that Viktor began to dream. At night, he was visited by strange figures, shadows wandering through the corridors of his room. He would laugh at himself in the morning, attributing everything to exhaustion. He grew up, became a doctor, gained prestige, and headed one of the most secret laboratories in the Soviet Union, the Institute of Anomalous Phenomena. Seems contradictory, doesn't it? But during the Cold War, not all secrets were in weapons. Some were kept at the frontiers of the mind. In Viktor's skin pulsed the conflict of every human being: reason versus mystery, faith versus proof, hope versus disillusionment. His scientific rigidity was also his greatest prison. Remember, as we listen to his story, to reflect. What about you? At what point did you allow or block the inexplicable from entering your life? It was the winter of 1979 when Viktor, already renowned, conducted unprecedented experiments on what he called subtle worlds, layers of reality where unknown forces could interfere with our physical world. He and his team worked in absolute secrecy, funded by an obscure government sector, interested in any supernatural advantage against the West. The results started timidly: small oscillations in equipment, interferences in electromagnetic readings. Then something changed. On a freezing dawn, when only the hum of fans filled the laboratory, a metallic object moved by itself. Cameras captured movements with no visible source. Lights flickered, papers flew, recordings registered whispering voices, words in unknown languages. At first, Viktor scoffed. Electrical fault, drafts, someone playing a trick, he'd say, forcing a smile. But the phenomena intensified. Reports of poltergeists, unexplained fainting spells, sudden temperature changes accumulated. Viktor, the staunch materialist, began to lose sleep. One night, while checking the isolation of the chambers, he heard a clear phrase behind him in archaic Russian: "Not everything can be measured." He turned around, and no one was there. These events reached the authorities' ears. In a regime where narrative control was a matter of survival, anything unpredictable was a threat. Viktor's superiors, terrified by the repercussions, quickly stormed the laboratory. Documents were confiscated, equipment disappeared, piles of reports, photographs, and tape recordings were taken to a military depot and without any warning burned until nothing but smoke remained. Viktor watched, outwardly impassive, inwardly devastated. Years of research erased. His colleagues vanished, transferred, or silenced. He remained isolated, marked, a ghost in the corridors of Soviet science. But that was just the beginning, because even after everything turned to ashes, the manifestations didn't stop. On the contrary, they intensified, and for the first time Viktor was afraid. Afraid of the unknown, afraid of not understanding. Afraid of having spent his entire life denying something that was now knocking at his door with brutal force. Think for a moment. What would you do if everything you believed in crumbled before your eyes? Would you try to save your logic, or would you dive into the abyss of mystery? Viktor Veynik was no ordinary researcher. He held a doctorate in quantum physics, lauded with medals for scientific merit. He published articles in leading journals, was invited to closed conferences behind the scenes in Moscow, and discussed major projects alongside generals and Central Committee members. His experiments on magnetic fields, particle physics, and altered states of matter blazed trails others would only dare to follow decades later. He was methodical, tireless, cold, and brilliant. When he said something was impossible, his peers trusted him. It was this same scientist, who dedicated his life to drawing formulas and doubting everything, who began to state with deep circles under his eyes and a lost gaze that there are forces that escape traditional physics, who personally witnessed objects moving, circuits burning out of nowhere, and sourceless voices recorded on tape, who came face to face with the inexplicable, despite having publicly ridiculed every single mystic, priest, medium, or religious person. Viktor wasn't alone. Decades later, his secret notes were found and analyzed by independent researchers who confirmed the anomalies recorded on the tapes. None of this was disclosed at the time. The Soviet system, fearing a stampede from materialistic thought, swept everything under the rug. But the truth withstands time. His name became an underground legend among dissident physicists and paranormal scholars. At this point, it's important to emphasize, there will hardly be more solid proof than the word of someone like Viktor, a man trained to doubt even himself. When a radical skeptic is forced to witness the impossible, something big is happening. If even he wavered before the mystery, why do we feel so secure in our certainties? Curious to know where this story goes? Then stick with me, because the questions only grow and so do the revelations. By the way, if you're identifying with this dilemma, share this video right now with someone who also needs to question the obvious. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss the next parts. The more people questioning, the closer we get to the answers. What would be the nature of subtle worlds? Could there be entire universes vibrating around us, intangible to our eyes but real in a way we can't even imagine? These strange phenomena, which escaped even Viktor's most sophisticated equipment, raised questions as old as humanity itself, but now cast under the sharp light of science. What exists beyond the material world? Are we just matter in motion? Or is there something more? A type of energy, a hidden dimension, that shapes and influences us, silent, omnipresent, but ignored purely due to limitations of perception. After the destruction of his research, Viktor began to live as an exile within himself. He avoided old colleagues, turned off lights early, skipped meals, but something inside him, a kind of thirst, wouldn't let him forget what he had witnessed. In the silence of the darkened corridors, his mind seethed. What if all of it were just explainable anomalies, system noise, hoaxes, or self-suggestion? What if, in truth, he had touched, even by accident, a layer of reality never before accessed by any other scientist? Deep down, Viktor knew there was an abyss between what science could prove and what humans could intuit. He started rereading his notes, now almost obsessively. He revisited fragile diagrams and hastily scribbled graphs, searching for patterns or hidden messages. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize the inexplicable, there was always an oppressive feeling that something was watching him when the lights went out, when the wind hit the window strangely, when certain devices hummed at an unusual frequency. The questions echoed. What, after all, are the subtle worlds? What hides in the empty spaces between atoms? Why do these phenomena happen precisely when we try to observe them? It was then, on a sleepless night, that Viktor rediscovered an old book from his childhood, a philosophical treatise by a Russian author named P.D. Ouspensky. Between the yellowed pages, he read, "Our world is only a shadow of something much larger, impossible to be perceived by common senses." That phrase lodged in his chest like a seed cast into the earth, unsettling, insistent, impossible to ignore. Perhaps, Viktor thought, traditional science's resistance to accepting the inexplicable is less a matter of proof and more a reflection of fear. Fear of admitting its own ignorance. Fear of looking into the abyss and realizing that, deep down, in that abyss, the abyss also looks back at us. And you? Have you ever felt there's something unexplainable guiding or interrupting your paths? Do you believe everything can be answered by equations, or is there room for mystery? Answer in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. Viktor had always been the most staunch of skeptics. When people talked about spiritual energy, he'd laugh scornfully. He considered mediums, religious people, and philosophers naive, victims of their own fear of death and the unknown. During his university days, he made a point of exposing any logical fallacy in discussions. For him, faith was just an emotional placebo. That's why, when faced with the inexplicable phenomena, he felt a mix of shame and anger. Like an architect watching his building collapse before his eyes, Viktor tried to rebuild his rational fortress brick by brick. There must be a trick. Maybe someone is manipulating the data. It could be mass hysteria, some gas leak, hypnosis, fraud. He gathered documents about fraudulent experiments from other times. He looked for books on neuroscience, parapsychology, even crime literature in search of some plausible pattern for the episodes. However, the team's reports were impossible to fit into any known explanation. "I saw a key turn in the air, with no wind, no magnetic field, no trick," reported Anna, his trusted assistant. Viktor held secret meetings to question every technical detail. He reviewed lines of code, isolated variables, changed equipment. With each new denial, his pride was wounded further. "It can't be! It can't!" Once, he found a cross drawn in pencil on his desk, accompanied by the words, "You don't know everything." The inveterate materialist began to lose faith in doubt itself. One episode was particularly striking. Alone in the laboratory, Viktor heard footsteps coming from the dark corridor. The clock read 3:33 a.m. He called for Anna. Nothing. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the glass of the door, hovered before his eyes, and dissipated like smoke. His body went cold, his mind screamed for rationality. Hallucination, lack of sleep, stress. But something, deep down, he knew. It wasn't just tiredness. It wasn't just his mind playing tricks. It was as if the world, so secure and mathematical, was tearing at its edges, and through those cracks, other realities whispered, mocking his skepticism. In the following days, Viktor tried to escape these signs. He got involved in parallel projects, sought alternative explanations, dove even deeper into books. But every time someone talked to him about supernatural experiences, he felt anger and, secretly, envy. Envy of those who could believe without needing proof. Envy of those who found meaning outside the equation. And you? When was the last time you doubted yourself, only to realize that life is much bigger than our certainties? Have you scoffed at the improbable and been surprised by it? Our protagonist was about to cross the border between skepticism and wonder, but that would demand a price from him. His pride. Like many of us, Viktor would have to lose to then find. If Viktor's nights were already restless, now they bordered on complete insomnia. The manifestations in his house began to mirror the phenomena in the laboratory, only with terrifying intensity. One night, his bedroom lamp flickered 3 times, always at the same time, 2:22 a.m. Another time, while reviewing old notes, a book fell from the shelf. When he opened it, a page was marked with a biblical passage. "Those who have eyes to see, see." Viktor, sweating cold, began to think it was no longer just electrical failures or coincidences. And then, something even more inexplicable. Shortly after the book episode, Viktor received anonymous letters, written in shaky handwriting, describing exactly the manifestations he had witnessed, but in details no one could have known. One of the letters read, "When science opens itself to the invisible, worlds will meet." At the same time, on the other side of the world, an account by Arthur Fort, an English medium famous for near-death experiences, began to circulate in the underground press. Arthur described in detail a vision he had during the hours he was dead after a car accident. I saw a city made of light. I heard sounds that did not belong to this world. My thoughts were like lights, circulating among people who were like vapor, but much more alive than any human. There were formless beings, voiceless voices, and a field, a space where anything was possible. I knew, even without understanding, that I had crossed a subtle boundary between two worlds. These experiences, which Viktor would never have considered relevant in the past, now seemed strangely familiar. Arthur Fort's details resonated with mysterious parallelism. The feeling of being watched, the electrical phenomena, the alteration in the flow of time, the presence of something greater. Viktor began to search for identical accounts in Russia itself. He discovered hundreds of archived cases, poltergeist episodes, people who reported feeling presences, objects that levitated, voices appearing from nowhere. With his scientific eye, he organized these accounts into graphs, sought patterns, separated the authentic from the fabricated. Defying statistics, he discovered that there was a secret logic to the phenomena. They appeared when someone in the group was in an existential crisis, a loss, an illness, an unanswered question. Until one phenomenon was impossible to ignore. On a quiet Sunday, Viktor felt a pressure in his chest, as if someone or something was pulling him out of his own body. He had a vision. He was in a dark corridor, with doors leading everywhere. In the background, an intense golden light, but not blinding. On the other side, human figures who smiled, but their faces changed constantly. They were his friends, his parents, people who had already passed away. He woke up in a panic, his body sweating, and the impression that, for an instant, he had truly crossed a boundary between worlds. The experiences accumulated, doors slamming shut by themselves, clocks stopping at the same time, repeatedly, unexplained noises around him, like whispers, a constant feeling of being watched. Instead of pushing him away, these experiences began to awaken in Viktor a new kind of curiosity, a hunger for meaning, no longer satisfied with ready answers. It was as if the subtle worlds were inviting him to step through a mirror, to see life as he had not dared to before. In parallel, Viktor began to dialogue with mediums and religious people, even receiving letters from Arthur Fort, who encouraged him to investigate his own dreams. For the first time, Viktor admitted feeling fear but also hope. Fear of the unknown, yes, but hope that, on the other side of the mystery, there might be answers to questions he never dared to ask. Now I want you to stop and answer. If you witnessed the impossible, would you have the courage to change your life? Or would you keep pretending everything is just coincidence? These extraordinary experiences are just the beginning. In the next chapters, Viktor will have to face the deepest crisis of his existence, and who knows, find the key that unites science and spirit. If this video is making sense to you, share it with someone who never stops asking, what if? Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments. Have you ever experienced something that challenged your logic? I'd really like to know your story and further enrich this collective investigation. Let's go together, because the truth and the mystery are still just beginning. Just when Viktor thought he'd experienced the full extent of fear and mystery, his own body brought the greatest confrontation. A sudden illness struck him down. The fever, merciless, robbed him of sleep and appetite. Doctors hesitated between diagnoses, unable to find a clear explanation for his symptoms. Days dragged on in a feverish stupor, between hallucinations and lapses of consciousness. In one of these deliriums, Viktor returned to childhood. He saw himself as a boy again, walking on the ice under the aurora borealis, feeling a protective, warm presence beside him. Upon waking, the images seemed as vivid as any real experience, and a greater restlessness filled his chest. He, who had spent his life fleeing the idea of spirit, was now haunted by the feeling that nothing else mattered but responding to that presence. It was at the height of his fever that he received an unexpected visit. A priest, called by an old family friend, silently entered his room. Viktor, pale and suspicious, tried to refuse any conversation, but he was too weak to impose his old rational arrogance. The priest didn't try to convert or preach. He sat, listened in silence to the scientist's few words, and then quietly read a passage from the Gospels. The words, seemingly mundane, created a resonance Viktor had never felt. It was as if the phrases struck an invisible bell, and his experiences, fears, and dreams lined up, forming a grand tapestry of hidden meaning. For the first time, he felt that perhaps the universe was an interwoven fabric of science and poetry, of logic and mystery, of body and spirit. That night, in the midst of delirium, Viktor had one last vision. He was in a golden wheat field with luminous figures around him. In the background, the echo of the phrase he had heard in the laboratory, "Not everything can be measured." He awoke crying, for the first time not from fear, but from a strange relief. It was as if he recognized deep in his soul that he was transcending the limits of the known, and this, far from being a defeat, was a liberation. Perhaps, he thought, all human striving is nothing more than a long reconciliation between the fear of the unknown and the fascination with eternity. And you? Have you ever felt that in crisis there's a seed of transformation? That pain can be the foundation of the greatest discovery? Comment below. What was your moment of greatest spiritual or personal turning point? Your experience might transform someone's journey. Recovered and spiritually touched, Viktor was no longer the same. He refused the role of rationalist martyr. On the contrary, he began to see every fragment of experience, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, as pieces of a larger mosaic, impossible to comprehend solely through traditional science. He decided, then, to revisit his notes, now illuminated by the words of the priest and the accounts of Arthur Fort, the medium. Incredibly, he discovered surprising parallels. The descriptions of subtle frequencies in his scientific research bore startling resemblances to ancient spiritual texts. When he read passages from the Gospels that spoke of invisible realms, he perceived in them the exact description of the diagrams he had drawn years earlier in his laboratory: layers, fields, forces interacting on distinct planes. Viktor realized that quantum physics, in certain respects, spoke of the same thresholds that religions named as heaven, hell, or the realm of spirits. The difference was merely one of language, not of essence. Corresponding with Arthur Fort, Viktor went further. He asked him to describe his near-death visions in scientific language. Arthur, in an emotional exchange of letters, replied, "When I was on the other side, I didn't find dogmas, but rather geometries, frequencies, structures. It was as if the consciousness of each being vibrated at its own note, forming harmony or dissonance depending on its inner life." Inspired, Viktor became the first Soviet scientist to propose still in never-published letters that consciousness is, perhaps, the bridge between matter and spirit. He began to advocate in small groups the idea that the scriptures might be metaphorical maps for physical realities yet undetected, and that physics, in turn, is a way to decipher the language of the prophets. This integration, so audacious, was controversial and dangerous, but Viktor felt, in every word, a deep echo. The fear of the unknown is just the other side of the fascination with mystery. At this point, Viktor no longer saw a distinction between science and spirituality. His experiences, Arthur's accounts, the diagrams, the priest's letters, everything seemed to point to a greater truth, a truth that unites the atom with prayer, the equation with ecstasy, the laboratory with the altar. And you? Have you ever felt that seemingly opposing experiences complete each other? That science and faith can be, deep down, different faces of the same quest? And now, after this journey full of fears, miracles, and mysteries, the definitive question remains: what if everything you believe is incomplete? What if the truth is bigger, deeper, and more paradoxical than any science or religion has dared to reveal? Imagine a world where scientists and mediums, physicists and poets, mathematicians and priests sit together at the same table, where questions don't serve to divide but to expand, where mystery isn't the enemy of reason, but rather the fuel for humanity's greatest quest, to understand who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. What Viktor learned, at the cost of his health, reputation, and even his own logic, was that the universe can never fit into a single theory, that every extraordinary experience, whether inside a Soviet laboratory, in the heart of a dying person, or in your own life, is an essential part of a much larger picture. So, I ask, have you ever experienced something unexplainable that changed your life forever? Do you believe there truly is a subtle, invisible world as real as the air we breathe? Share your opinion in the comments. I want to hear about your experiences, your fears, your transformations. Together, let's build a community where mystery is welcome and the impossible is just the next step in understanding. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who also seeks meaning beyond the obvious. The more voices, the further we can go. And remember, perhaps, in the end, the answer to the greatest mystery is to accept that the search never ends, and that's precisely where the beauty of existence lies. See you in the next chapter of this journey.